Did you have a question? Or?
Yeah, lots of questions. What are the activities, the given activities that you're talking about that contribute to?
And the main source of cause of global warming is from the burning of fossil fuels, which are things like coal, oil, gasoline. So everything, the electricity running this room, the fuel we put in our cars, those are the main contributors to. That started right back in even earlier than that, back in the Industrial Revolution in the beginning of the 19th century. So I showed you that quote from the 1978 report, where basically saying that one of the best things we could do is have a clear statement of our ignorance, and I think you could take that statement and apply it to this issue of hurricanes and global warming. There's also a great deal that we don't understand about how hurricane activity will respond to global warming. Now, the other thing that's a concern for South Florida is sea level rise. And what I've shown here is, again, the observed changes in sea level as a function of time. So these are the years from 1800 to 2000. This is the observed changes in sea level here in millimeters. And starting at 2000, this is the projections of how much the sea level will rise over the next century from this Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And you can see basically the median here of the projection is about a 1 foot rise in sea level by the end of the century. And with an upper bound of maybe 1.5 feet or so.
A lot of the data you've been showing us shows a pattern between either cooling or warming, I guess, of surface temperature or the Earth's temperature and stuff. What would you say to critics saying that the warming and the cooling of the Earth is a natural process of the Earth itself?
There are certainly, the Earth's climate does change naturally. I mean, there have been, it has been ice ages where it was so cold there were ice sheets all the way down to St. Louis, and there have been other times where the Earth naturally was so warm that there was no ice anywhere, not on Greenland, not in Antarctica. So the Earth's climate does go through natural variations. The difference with what's happened over the last century and what's projected to occur over the next century, one are the cause of those changes aren't coming from natural sources, but from the contributions of humans to the increase in greenhouse gases. And the second thing is that the natural changes in climate typically take place on very long timescales. I mean, the last ice age, the last maximum extent of the ice sheets was over 20,000 years ago. Here we're talking about changes on timescales of decades to centuries, not thousands or tens of thousands of years. So the changes that we're expecting to see are going to occur much more rapidly than they typically would occur under natural sources of climate change.
Does the warming lead to another ice age?
Brian, can you please repeat the question?
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so the question was, will the warming lead to another ice age? In fact, the short answer is no. There's actually some concerns that the planet might actually get so warm that the next ice age is due in maybe another 30,000 years, that the planet might get so warm due to human activities that it would prevent it from entering another ice age. That's one of the possibilities that is actually debated. Okay, so if I look at this, I think a 1 foot rise in sea level, my house is at 9 feet above sea level. A 1 foot rise in sea level 100 years doesn't really concern me. I mean, people who may be closer to the shore, this I don't get worried about. But I'm still concerned about the issue of sea level rise. And one of the reasons is if we go back and look at what the IPCC projections of sea level rise have been, say, over the last 15 years, where we have observations we can compare them against, here are basically the 3 different projections from the IPCC, a low bound, middle of the road, and their upper bound. And we can see that the observed change in sea level over the last decade and a half has really been at the upper end of the IPCC projections, suggesting that there are things that maybe these sea level projections from the IPCC aren't accurately taking into account. And what might those be? One of the things that's surprising that was mentioned earlier is how dramatically the sea ice over the Arctic Ocean has been decreasing over the last decade or two. And what I've shown here is this is the summertime minimum sea ice Arctic extent, and this is what it was in 2007, and you can compare that to what it was here. The green line shows the extent of sea ice over the Arctic Ocean in 2005, This yellow line shows the extent between 1979, the average extent between 1979 and 2000. And so you can see that just in the last, and this is just a time series of the decrease in sea ice coverage over the last 20 years. You can see there's been a steady decrease, but especially over the last 5 years, there's been a dramatic decline in the sea ice.
How about the opposite side of it?
And the opposite side, Antarctica is actually, there's a continent underneath, so it's land-based ice. And Antarctica, we don't have very good observations for, one, so to tell exactly how much ice has been moving, been melting off of Antarctica. From the best estimates suggest that there's been some melting or very little change in the amount of ice on Antarctica. And I'll contrast that in a second with what's happening in Greenland. So there's 2 points to make with this. One is that, okay, this is sea ice. It's already floating on the ocean. So if it melts, it's like if an ice cube melts in your glass, it's not gonna, it doesn't increase the sea level any. So as far as its contribution to sea level rise, this is 0. So all this loss of sea ice in the Arctic hasn't contributed at all to the recent sea level rise. But what it does do is that ice obviously is very bright. It reflects a lot of sunlight back to space. And you can see in this graphic, it's trying to illustrate it, the ocean is much darker. It absorbs much more of the sunlight. So as the Arctic Ocean loses sea ice and exposes the ocean underneath, it absorbs a lot more sunlight. And that causes the ocean to warm more, which melts more sea ice. So there's a feedback here, a positive amplification. And that acts to accelerate the warming of the Arctic. And one of the things that the warming of the Arctic results in is a loss of ice over Greenland, say. Now we have ice that's actually sitting on land, and when it melts and runs off into the water, that does contribute to an increase in sea level. And what this map shows is the portions of the Greenland ice sheet that were melting in 1992 here in pink, and the portions that were melting in 2005, excuse me, here in red. And you can see that there has been a very dramatic increase in the amount of, you can basically consider this the amount of the Greenland ice sheet that's above freezing and melting over the last 15 years or so. And so when this ice does melt and run into the ocean, it does contribute to an increase in sea level. And what do those melts look like? This is an example. They form these giant rivers and lakes on the surface of the Greenland ice sheet. The water sort of erodes its way through the ice. It seeps down to the bottom, and then it actually lubricates the bottom of the ice sheet. And one of the concerns is that there's 2 ways that melting of ice can, or the ice from the Greenland ice sheet can end up into the ocean. One is that it just melts like this and runs off into the ocean. The other way is that as this water runs down and lubricates the bedrock underneath the ice sheet, that the ice itself can just flow like toothpaste into the ocean. And you can see, here's a satellite picture. You can go on Google and look at, and this is the Greenland ice sheet, and all these ponds and lakes you can see actually forming on the surface. And this is a glacier flow that's basically being squirted out from the Greenland ice sheet into the Atlantic Ocean. And the thing is that this lubricating effect, that this effect of the meltwater lubricating the ice sheets and then having it squirt out into the ocean, this is something that's not included in these model projections that are used by IPCC. And this has caused a lot of people to claim that the projected changes in sea level rise by the IPCC are very likely to be underestimating what the actual sea level change will be over the 21st century.